Diego. I think this is the first time I've been back since I left here about a year and a half ago. And the weather's a little bit nicer than it is on the East Coast right now, and it looks like it's going to stay that way for a couple of days. So, again, fun to be with this group. I see a lot of friends, a lot of former shipmates and acquaintances from the San Diego area. I think this is clearly a very appropriate topic. It's one that every one of the panel members here is very passionate about. It's one we wrestle with on a daily basis, and I think it's going to be good. So again, it's how do we regain the skills necessary to fight in the high-end warfare and survive in that domain. And one of the interesting discussions that we had in preparation for this thing is every one of us kind of is a little bit taken aback by the regain, because I would tell you, and I think everybody up here would agree with that we've got the best naval warfighting capability that the country's ever had. We are very good at what we do. Our sailors are the best they've ever been. The equipment is the best we've ever had it. And I think in fairness, we focused it on the right things at the right time with the strategic environment that we are dealing with. And the question is now, what do we need to do to just make sure that we're current, that we're dealing with the threat as it exists today, and that we're ready for the threat as it starts to change into the future? And that's really the question, because we do a great job, and we are supported not only by our great sailors, but by our industry partners, and I think by leadership throughout the country. So thank you for all of that, and thank you for the support. Again, I think it's a matter of retooling, refocusing, and making sure that we stay ahead of the game. Our panel members have just a wealth of background and experience, and I'd like to kind of go through very briefly each of them to give you an idea of the perspectives that they come from. I'll start left to right here. Admiral Tom Roden, a consummate surface warfare officer, second to none. Nuclear trained, been a carrier reactor officer, but more importantly has commanded in the surface world at every level and done a superb job. Strike Group Commander for both Reagan and Nimitz strike groups here out of San Diego, back when I was at 3rd Fleet, and tremendous operational capability when he did that. He is currently serving as the Director of Surface Warfare in Washington, and keep in mind with the restructure that we've done back there on the staff, the high nines, the directors of the warfare communities, are now in charge of all aspects to include the man, train, equip, not just procurement on the front end. That changes things in a very positive way in my mind, something that Admiral Greenert has worked hard to get in place, and Tom is one of the great leaders that's putting that out there. And so he can address all those questions. Are we focusing on the right thing in the right place at the right time? Glad to have him on the board. I've got Admiral Woody Lewis, superb pilot, and just had a great career also. So Squadron Command, VFA rather, 15 and 106. He was CAG 3 on board Truman. How about this? He was an exchange pilot and tactics instructor aboard HMS Invincible. That brings, again, a different, unique opinion and view of the world that is something people may want to ask questions. You know, how we work with our allies, does that make a difference in this changing environment that we're operating with? He was the battle director for Kayak and Al Adid in Qatar. He was the Maritime Ops Center Director at 5th Fleet, our Naval Forces U.S. Central Command in Bahrain. Obviously, both those jobs, again, very enriching and kind of life-changing in the way you approach things. He's got over 100 combat missions. He's got over 5,000 hours and I think over 1,000 arrested landings. Here's a guy that's been around and has done stuff. He was Pilot of the Year, I think, for Surface Forces, not meaning to embarrass you way back there when you were a little bit younger and doing great stuff. And he has migrated into what I think is the premier aviation assignment, and that's in charge of our Warfare Center of Excellence out at Fallon, and doing a great job. So he is in charge really of all the training and the workups, making sure that our aviators are prepared as a strike group entity to go forward and do exactly what we're asking them. It's whether it's doing air to ground with great precision, which we have in fact been working on for the last few years, or providing that air-to-air, knock down the door, fight that high-end warfare, exactly what this group is interested in talking about. So again, glad to have Woody on the team. Jim Rodman, here's another guy with a diverse background and wonderful experience, and everything that he does is integral, again, into integrating the different pieces that we have throughout the Navy and making sure they work together as a package. So he's an aerospace engineer, undergraduate. He is a lawyer, licensed to practice, I think in Pennsylvania, Villanova guy. One of my next door neighbors when we were out here in San Diego. He's got a master's degree at Wharton Business School, pretty good. He was a direct accession as an engineering duty officer, worked on surface ships, but really I think his focus has been more on system of systems, of networks, putting things together, and he now serves as the the chief engineer, if you will, for SPAWAR right here in San Diego, a very, very demanding job. And again, think how that applies to everybody in every system and where we are going and operating into the future. Worked both in the public sector as well as in uniform. And he's got an intel piece in there that with NRO and a couple places like that, that kind of rounds out that level of experience. So again, a different view on where we're going for this high-end game. Bob Hennigan, recently retired, much like myself, a consummate submariner, CEO of Buffalo, SSN 715, but he also had Submarine Squadron 6 and 8, Submarine Group 9 up in the Pacific Northwest. 9 has the SSBNs and the SSGNs. How does that strategic aspect play and what we're doing for high-end warfare? Deterrence is a key piece of that, and I think will come to play in a large degree as we start looking at Ohio replacement and all the things that play out. If that is not part of our equation and how we deal with the future, we're not thinking about things very holistically. Most recently, he was the commander at NMOC right here at Point Loma, so Naval Mine and Anti-Submarine Warfare Command. And he probably got more of a dose than he thought he was going to get into mine warfare than any of us. So when you think about getting the 4 extra mine sweeps out of San Diego, getting them forward into Bahrain at a time when we need to do that for Central Command to change some stuff, the environment that was going on over there with Iran, he got the folks out there, they were ready. They were up and operational, went straight into a major exercise, and it made a significant change in how the international politics was being played in the Gulf. So again, a guy with a great background, a little bit different view, a little more strategic than perhaps tactical in some of the stuff. Superb effort, a great partner to have out here, and I enjoyed working with those guys. So we have a very diverse group, so you ought to be thinking about questions. We'll try to jump into that real quickly. I'd like to offer just a couple of thoughts. When I think about things like this, I kind of bundle them to make them easy for me, and I think about them in people, in ideas, and in things, kind of those bundles, and it's kind of a simple term. So when I talk people, it's training, it's seniority, it's experience, perhaps the exercises that we put folks in. It's our most important asset in the Navy, and I truly believe that. When I talk ideas, it could be ConOps or tech memos, it could be strategy, it could be thinking and how we deal with uncertainty and the unknown and adapt and adjust and take it to the next level. Equipment is probably what most of the folks, I see a lot of suits out there, what you guys think about. You know, it's the stuff that we build, whether it's platforms or payloads or the integration of the two, operating together. It's our equipment. How about the human factors, design, engineering? I was at Pax River the other day, and I was taking a joint strike fighter stuff, and I think we had some of those discussions here also over this week, and it was fascinating to see where we're going there and how we are making things more easy to be utilized by the pilots so they can focus on what's important, which is the warfighting aspect as opposed to maybe the flying of the aircraft and challenges. And I would offer every one of our system needs to be that way. So capabilities, limitations. So you get some great insight. Terrific folks up here. Ask questions. I'm just going to say a couple things. I'm going to say unmanned, energy weapons or energy bigger, networking, simulation, cyber, knowledge across the board. Use those to develop some questions. And with that, Tom, over to you.
Thank you, sir. You know, I flew out here from Washington, D.C. yesterday, and I was talking to Terry Blake over after lunch, and he told me that it's already snowing in Washington, D.C., and I see that there's a bunch of us that are here from Washington, and it's not like we need yet another reason to love being in San Diego, but we're provided one with the snow that's falling down in Washington, D.C. It's great to be here. It's great to be here out here with all of you. A special thanks to both AFC and USNI for the invitation to come out here and spend a little bit of time talking to you about something, as Rick pointed out, has been a passion of mine, and I think over the past 2 years that I've been the resource and requirements guy for the CNO has only increased as we look at how we're going to address this particular subject. I think Rick touched on the point that, and I think we all kind of had a visceral reaction to the regain aspect of the skills for the high-end warfight. And I think really what I think about is what's not implied in the title of this panel. And what's not implied is that we've been working on the right stuff over the last 2+ decades. We've had to get very, very good at precision strike, and we have gotten very, very good at precision strike. We've had to get very good at visit, boarding, search, and seizure, and having to collect the information for the fight on terror. We've been working on the right things, but now I think one of the things that we have to think about as we look to the future is perhaps the nation's calling has changed, and I think that's more the implication of the title of the panel. The nation's calling changed, I think, not only from and I think what that drives us to is that drives us to what skills do we need to hone to ensure that we can continue to execute the high-end warfight against that major adversary. And I think that's really where we need to focus. I think there's a couple of other focusing things that have happened over the last couple years. One is, and I had the good fortune of being on CNO's transition team, and I was sitting in the room when Jamie Fogo and Joe Murphy and a few of the folks, and we were kind of kicking around this idea of tenets, and we came up with warfighting first, operate forward, be ready. And I think that we have latched on to that aspect of warfighting first. And that's certainly something that I spend time talking to the team in N96 about how we're going to continue to emphasize and resource that appropriately. And then I think the third piece, and certainly there's been some conversation about it, is the rebalance to the Pacific. And as I look at focusing the resources, focusing the requirements, focusing where we're driving surface warfare from that perspective, I think you have to pay attention to the rebalance to the Pacific and what the implications are for surface warfare. And I think to kind of set the stage for where we're going, I think we do have to have a little bit of a retrospective look at where we've been. And I think perhaps the person that was sat down to write the title was perhaps a person that of this panel was a person that had in fact been pretty ensconced in the execution of the Cold War. But I think that it's different now than in the Cold War, and I'm not suggesting in any way, shape, or form that we're going into it. There's no existential threat like there was in the Cold War. There wasn't any warm conflict like we had in the Cold War. There wasn't. We're not split into influence blocks, but the capability and the availability of the threat set that we're facing is dramatically higher now, I think, than it was when we faced back in the Cold War. So what are the lessons that we can learn from that time? And I had about 6 or 8 years of it, operating on both Texas and Bunker Hill out in the Western Pacific, before the wall came down and things changed for us in that aspect. The first thing I think is practice, practice, practice. We took advantage of every single minute we had when we got Bunker Hill underway from Tokyo 1, and whether we went right or left, it was Soviet submarines, it was Soviet aircraft, and it was Soviet surface ships, and they were all over the place. And we had to be the best at what we were from the time we went out of Tokyo Bay. I think we need to ensure that as we move forward, we demand the most out of our time at sea, and we have to take advantage of the embedded training devices, and we have to look at simulation. We have to look at those aspects of how we can fold that into ensuring that we can continue to execute the high-end fight. I think there needs to be a subtle mindset shift, if you will, with respect to how we in surface warfare think about going to sea. I think what we have to do is we have to think seriously about tactics and concepts. You know, I know Woody up at Fallon, and I, as a strike group commander for a couple of strike groups, got to spend time up there, and I see some serious work. We have to do that in surface warfare, and I'll talk a little bit about how I think we're going to go get at that. I think we need to be a force of readers. I think we need to be a force of studiers. I think we need to be a force of people who are ensconced in the craft of going to sea and executing what it is we do in surface warfare. I think we need to read, and I think we need to be able to put that into action as we move forward. I think there's a ton of great tactical thinking out there, and I think that we have to ensure that as we pull it out of the safes, as we pull it off the shelves, if that's the right tactics, we need to dust them off, and we need to make sure that we know them down to our core, and if we don't, we need to change them. I think we need to know the threat. I remember going through the department head school, and you had to know the threat matrix cold. If you didn't know the threat matrix cold, you weren't going to pass, you were going to get rolled back, or you were going to get thrown out. There's a lot of adversaries out there, whether it's in the Middle East, whether it's in the Eastern Mediterranean, or whether it's in the Western Pacific. There are a lot of threats out there. And we in surface warfare have to ensure that we know the threat. I think we have to get very comfortable in our knowledge in the generation of the tactics and in the generation of and in the understanding of what we're up against. Be very comfortable in that knowledge and the execution of the things that we're going to be required to do. And I think we've got to take it seriously. I think we've got to avoid overconfidence. I think we've got to network with our potential partners and potential allies, and I think we've got to work very closely with them. One of the things that I had the opportunity to do, both as Desron 60 and as Commander Naval Forces Korea, is understand how we work with different navies, especially when I was over in Desron 60 and I was working the Black Sea or I was working down in Africa. I worked with a lot of different ships, and I got to tell you that if you take if you go take it for most of the navies that we deal with, you take a DDG, you take a cruiser, you take a carrier submarine, and you try to build partnership capacity, a lot of the navies out there are going to choke on those ships. But the littoral combat ship that we are building, that we are fielding, with the SUW package or the ASW package or the mine package, I think are good ships to go build partnership capacity. Admiral Gortney at the keynote talked about Phase 1-0 operations. I think those ships are excellent ships in order to be able to further the cause in Phase 1-0. I think we have to think about the weapons that we're fielding. I think all too often, our adversaries, our potential adversaries, are getting into our heads. I think we need to field weapons that we get into his head and make him scratch his head and figure out how are we going to handle this? What are we going to do? So what can we do in surface warfare? One of the things that I'm working with Admiral Copeman on, and especially on the resourcing side for the seat that I am in now, is get the Navy Surface and Expeditionary Warfare Command up and running. Get it staffed with the weapons and tactics instructors, get it working on the right things that it needs to do to address the things that I've talked about previously. And I think that there are three things that are core to surface warfare that we have to take a look at, and we have to ensure that we continue to be the best in the world at. The first is, core to surface warfare is the execution of ASW in the inner screen. There are subsurface threats out there, and we do the inner screen. We're fielding some fantastic capabilities, not only in the QQ-89 AV-15 system, but also in the mission package that's going to go, the ASW mission package that's going to go on LCS. We do the inner screen ASW. We have to be the best at it. We've got to start, I listened to Admiral Copeman talk about how we have to get after the long-range OASUW piece. We have to go after that. We've got Harpoon, we've got Standard missiles, we've got, a long time ago, we had TASM, we've got LRASM coming on, perhaps we got the railgun, perhaps we got lasers. We've got other things that we can do, but we have to get after it. Certainly, I think there's a shared responsibility between the air wing on the aircraft carrier and the surface ships that are going to be executing the long-range OASUW piece for execution of the war at sea. But the fact of the matter is, you have to have the persistence of the surface ships in order to be able to execute that mission area. And we have been central in integrated air and missile defense. AAW has always been kind of prime for us, but I wasn't worried about ballistic missiles, anti-ship ballistic missiles, and some of the significant cruise missile threats that we have when I was back on the as a combat system officer on Bunker Hill. We've got to understand what it is we've got to do, and we've got to go attack it, and we have to be the best at this because, again, this is core to what it is we do in surface warfare. We've got the Air and Missile Defense Radar coming on. We've got Standard Missile 6 coming on. We've got Navy Integrated Fire Control Counter-Air, which we are now consummating engagements with that capability. And we have to be proficient in the execution of those, understand the concepts of those, and then move those forward in order to get at this issue. And finally, for the fleet sailors out there, I'll tell you this. I've talked a lot of stuff that we've got to go pile onto the plate. One of the things that I'm most encouraged about with the work that Fleet Forces Command is doing with OFRP is I think there's a serious look at the fact that we've got to pull some stuff off the plate. And so for the fleet sailors out there, I think it's important that us in surface warfare leadership say, all right, if we're going to go pile more stuff on or concentrate on more stuff, we've got to pull some stuff back. And with that, I'll turn it over to Woody. I thank you very much for the time. Again, my sincere appreciation to AFCEA and USNI, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you very much. Woody, over to you, my friend.
Well, good afternoon, and thanks to the Naval Institute and the organization here, and thanks for all of you to be here to listen to a few words of what we got to say. As the dumbest guy on the panel, you know, there's two nukes and a lawyer up here. I'm going to look at this a little bit differently than my compatriots up here. My background is almost exclusively tactical and operational, flying airplanes, being on tactical and operational staffs. So my, you know, in using Admiral Hunt's, areas of emphasis, my emphasis is really on the people side and on the ideas side, and where I'm looking at this. And, you know, going into it from attaining and regaining our skills in the high-end fight. As Admiral Roden just talked about, you know, we've been doing for the last 10 years or so the things we've had to do to win the fight in Afghanistan and Iraq. Naval Aviation has been very focused on those two things, and that is an absolute, we cannot fail in that mission, and we've done a pretty good job. We spent a lot of time and a lot of effort training to that piece. But now, what is the high-end fight? How can we define that? First of all, I would say there's some assumptions going into it, and I can only remember 3 things at a time. So I'll give you 3 assumptions and then 3 things on how I think we do some things differently or do more of the same to be able to regain those skills for the high-end fight. The first assumption for those of you that were at the keynote address today with Admiral Gortney, talking about the Carrier Strike Group and all its bits and pieces being the basic fighting unit. We have, the assumption we have to make, I believe, and especially since, the boss is telling us that's the assumption, so that now becomes a fact in my book. But the Carrier Strike Group, so the carrier, the air wing, all the surface combatants, all the shore-based assets that support it, the submarines, everything together is the basic fighting unit. We have to, that's the going-in assumption. Secondly, what exactly is the high-end fight? How I would describe that is building a sanctuary in which we can operate free from interdiction by bad guys, so when it's time to go do bad things to them, we can do that. Right now we have a sanctuary in Afghanistan, and we had a sanctuary previously in Iraq, usually in the nighttime. We operate in night better than anybody else, certainly any adversaries in those 2 countries. In the maritime, whether it be in the Western Pacific or in the Middle East now, there's an encroachment on the maritime in which we have to build that sanctuary in which to be able to fight. That's what the high-end fight is. And so we build a sanctuary within that high-end fight, and everything that we do is integrated strike group operations. In other words, anti-submarine warfare, anti-surface warfare, air defense. We've too long looked at this as kind of stovepipe You know, the whiskey's responsible for air defense, or the Sea Combat Commander is responsible for ASUW. We can't look at it that way. We have to look at it as everybody working that problem together. That's the going in assumption from my standpoint. And then finally, from an assumption of if we train to the high-end fight, then those skills that we attain in the high-end fight are easily translatable to a low-end fight, which we've done. We've proven that over time as well. So how are we going to do that from my perspective at NSOC and from my background is, you know, first and foremost, starting with, you know, developing or reestablishing tactical excellence at the individual level, at the unit level, and at the integrated strike group level. In other words, train the people with the stuff we have, with the airplanes that we have, the ships we have, the systems that we have. Train and be good with the things we have. That's what we have learned over about 40 years or so at NSOC. That's the first going-in tenet of the command. And then next, train to a standard. We've heard this time and again from various panels, but train in a standardized method. Admiral Gordy talked earlier today, and Admiral Floyd earlier today, about training to the same standardized capabilities, tasks, mission sets, regardless of whether you're training in San Diego before you deploy or you're training on Norfolk before you deploy. But we've got to train to that standardized mission set and do it, and so we can plug and play, go anywhere in the world when we deploy. And then finally, I think from a standpoint of how we're going to do some of these things, one of the things that we have got to take better advantage of is live, virtual, and constructive training. And my community in the aviation world is probably the biggest offenders of not liking simulation because it's a threat to flight time. You know, we all want to count how many hours we have in our logbooks. But the reality of it is to train to a high-end mission, air defense using integrated fire control, for example. We do not have the range space. We do not have the security levels that we can set in a live range. And we don't have the ability to keep our adversaries from watching us while we're training in a fully live environment. We've got to take advantage of the mission rehearsal trainers and the constructive modeling that we can do, and then last that all up in a distributed manner, ultimately, to be able to train that way. And there's a huge challenge there. There is a technical challenge. There's also an IA challenge across security levels in which we're wrestling with quite a bit now. But it's something we got to get to be able to operate in phase 0, phase 1 operations, and if need be, transition to phase 2 and 3 operations in air defense in that example. But with that, that's my perspective. I'm ready for any questions you might have for me. Thank you.
So thanks, Woody. I'm going to maybe turn this around a little bit. So I'm going to do go to the lawyer thing and do a little Socratic and ask you guys a question. How many folks in this audience today were impacted by the Target shopping issue, or know somebody who was impacted by the Target shopping issue? All right, so it looks like over 50%, right? Now, if you read the press reports of the Target cyber issue, turns out that it looks like the likely point of entry for Target was through an HVAC contractor who did work for Target, who had an automated billing system, that could be have been attached to target. Now, they're still looking at that, but the reason I bring that up was I think what Admiral Rowden and Admiral Lewis just talked about was, you know, the United States has had for years a tremendous asymmetric advantage in that we dominate without a doubt the physical world. We build systems and machines that have no peer adversary anywhere else in the world. So whether you look at the surface world, the subsurface world, the aviation world, and even space, we dominate that world. But guess what? About 30 years ago, we created this artificial world ourselves called cyberspace. And if you think about that artificial world that we created it because, again, we wanted an asymmetric advantage. We wanted a better way for our warfighting forces to share data. But lo and behold, we let that artificial world get turned loose to commercial industry. And it turned out that it turned into something I don't think any of us in this audience ever expected it to turn into. And I guess you have to step back and you look at this high-end fight today, and you have to think to yourself, can we dominate that artificial world that we created? Is it possible? And, you know, I read an interesting article in my University of Pennsylvania alumni magazine that just came in December. And it said the number of mobile devices today on the planet exceeds the number of bathrooms. Think about that for a minute. Basic human function, mobile device, right? Now, you know, that's kind of a startling statistic because what that says is that mobile device, which is more powerful than some of the computers that we actually have in some of our platforms today, can be utilized by any adversary who holds it to achieve some warfighting effect on our forces or our economy. And if you think about the future, you hear industry talk about the Internet of Things, right? Where everything's going to have an IP device. I don't know anybody got a Fitbit today? Anybody running around with their Fitbit? I mean, I got plenty of folks, right, who wear Fitbits to the office, and I get Facebook posts on, hey, I sat down 5 minutes ago, and hey, I just walked to the bathroom. You know, it's great data, but the only reason I'm getting that information is because that thing has an IP device. And if you look at where industry is going to the point where everything's going to have an IP device, including your refrigerator. So it begs the question about if we're to achieve the type of warfighting asymmetric advantage that we really want, how do we go about thinking about that cyberspace world that we created in a different way than we approach it today so that we can actually do that domination? And I'll tell you, you know, the way we look at it today, where we look at our systems in isolation, probably isn't the right way to look at that problem. Because the reality is, that's not the way our adversaries look at that problem. They see the Navy or the Air Force or the Army, right, as one holistic enterprise. And unless we start looking at it as that holistic enterprise, you know, we're not going to get to keep the asymmetric advantage that we've had for years. So how do we do that? First thing is we have to stop looking at our systems in isolation. And we talked a little bit about today about being able to dominate those physical worlds. Well, those physical worlds, whether it be sensors or systems, right, we've wired them all together in some respects. And we have to figure out a way to look at that from an end-to-end enterprise perspective. And we've got to think about, from that enterprise perspective, if I was an adversary looking at that enterprise, what's the most vulnerable part of that enterprise? But we also have to look at it from the perspective of it does give us an advantage in respect to the way we have the ability to share information. Because today, often our systems are still fairly stovepiped, and we don't do as good a job as we probably can in sharing information. And remember, the key is that it's really the key in that asymmetric advantage is in the power of that information and that data. We also have to take a look at how we train our folks. Admiral Hunt, and I think Admiral Rowden, they all said it really well, right? When we look at how we train our sailors today in using those systems, we don't really actually optimize how we get training in front of those sailors so that we make these systems easy to use. And it may be that we're actually not even bringing folks into the service that actually can utilize those systems in the way. You know, one of the things we talk to the fleet all the time about is there's a lot of deployed capability out there today in the cyberspace arena, but we don't necessarily always use it the way it was designed. So we've got to get our arms around that problem. And then we've got to think about, well, what does this cyberspace world look like 5 years or 10 years or 15 years down the road? And now, how do we start to build that capability into our platform so that we're on the leading edge of those technologies and not necessarily at the peer level with our adversaries? And that takes a little bit of a different spin on how you might look at how you prepare yourself for that future endeavor. I will tell you, one of the things that we're trying to do in the acquisition world is we're looking at platforms from a standardization standpoint. And we're working really closely with Admiral Rowden's team to look at, from an IT perspective, how do we get more standardization built into our platforms? How do we get more cyber bang for the buck with regard to the systems that we deploy today, so that it's not just about efficiency, it's about warfighting effectiveness. And if we can continue to build more standardization and build more warfighting effectiveness into those platforms, it makes it easier for the sailors to train on, and it makes it easier for the warfighters to use. And it also makes it easier for us to deploy capability faster, because the one thing we can't afford is we can't afford to allow the adversaries, because of the ease of this cyber domain, to overtake us. If you look at the adversary, the adversaries that we face today are a hell of a lot different than the adversaries we faced 20 years ago. It's not just a nation state. It's some guy in a cave with a laptop and an air card. And it's incumbent upon us to be able to provide the warfighting capabilities to the Admiraloses of the world so that they can actually go in and get that target. And we can only achieve that through cyberspace. So, when I look at this problem, I guess what I'd ask everybody in the audience to think about is look at how your daily lives today are influenced by the devices that you use and the ubiquitous connectivity that you demand, and our warfighters demand no less. And it'll take a different mindset for us to think about that problem in the future and how we not only go about designing our systems, but also training our sailors how to use those systems. I'll turn it over to Bob.
Well, thank you, and it's good to be here this afternoon. Admiral Daly, I'll echo the thanks of everyone else. This has been a great forum here. I appreciate your entire team putting that together. I'm also sure, sir, that you're very pleased. You've trained us all to challenge the assumptions here, and we've just about beat to death this word of regain in the question there. But it's interesting. It did catch everybody's eye. I wrote down refine and groom. Other guys have mentioned hone and retool. It doesn't really matter the particular words. I will tell you, if you sat through the past couple days, I think the fleet commanders and the TICOMs have certainly articulated many examples of where the current day warfighters are doing a terrific job. And I certainly saw that in my time up at Group 9 with the submarine force and the Special Forces guys, and then most recently down here at MMOC with the aviation and surface warfare and submarine guys. So across the board, I think we're at a good place to look ahead. So now that they've challenged one assumption here the team has, I'll put out an assumption, and then maybe you can challenge it in the Q&A coming back. And it's in an effort to talk to this topic about what are we going to do for the high-end warfighter in the future. And I think then you have to think about the future a little bit. And so the assumption that I'll throw out there is that, and it shouldn't surprise anybody here, that unmanned systems of all types in each domain will be an integral part of the high-end warfighter of the future. Now, that's my words, but if you don't believe me, you can pick up the San Diego Tribune just about 2 weeks ago. The CNO was out here. He was asked what his number 2 agenda item was. He talked to unmanned systems. By the way, number 1 was the electromagnetic spectrum. Another interesting article from Mr. Work and Mr. Brimley at CNAS talks specifically about prepare for robotic warfare. And in the interest of time, I won't quote the 3 items on that other than the last thing that says, this report concludes that the Defense Department must make it a priority to invest in military robotics. So we'll set the stage and assume that those robots are going to be out there. And then I guess what I would say is if the robots are going to be out there, then the sensors are going to be out there. Each robot We'll have several sensors, I would say, and with those sensors is going to come increased data rates and increased information rates. And so where is the warfighter going to fit in that picture of information? Certainly in the old days when I started here on the haddock 30 years ago, we fused all that information on a paper plot in the control room. But now, as these multiple information streams come in, I think we have to think about some of those information streams in the area that I've perhaps worked most in, the undersea domain. Fixed systems might deliver information streams back to Whidbey Island. Other systems will deliver information to Stennis, and we could go down that list. So I think the challenge as we think about supporting the high-end warfighter of the future is, again, how will that information get fused? And will we perhaps inadvertently create information stovepipes unintentionally, but that we will spend lots of dollars correcting on the other end here. It's interesting, the CNO's article talks about the opportunity to save significant costs as we go after this unmanned systems, and I think that's an example. So I'll call it COTS for robots, and the topic is, are we going to have common architecture, common software, common sensors when we can? Will the operators look at a common display, and therefore can their training pipelines be a common training pipeline? So we don't need a schoolhouse in New London for the submariners and one in Norfolk for the surface warfare guys, or Newport or whatever. Maybe we can get them all in the same place. So thinking about that affordability thing, I think is something that the folks in this room right now can have an impact on as these robots come out the other end and enter the warfight in the next decade. And addressing that tail, I think, will be key to how we may impact and then train the warfighter of the future. So I'll just lastly tell you, I think particularly in the undersea domain, we've had a lot of talk about the pivot to the Pacific. You'll also see lots of discussion about how we absolutely must maintain the dominance in the undersea. Those aren't my words. You can see plenty of it. And as you all know, undersea warfare is a slow game with small pieces of data hidden in large, small pieces of information hidden in large data streams. So this question of fusion and how we're going to do it as we bring so many more sensors into the game, I think folks here can really put their minds to it in industry and as the warfighters, and perhaps have a great impact. I also just mentioned one thing that I've thought a little bit about, and perhaps you can push back in the Q&A, is as we think about fusing things and we get away from platforms, right? As you think about building a surface ship or the LCS or the Virginia or whatever, Joint Strike Fighter, there's a synergy, I believe, there that forces the dialogue to integrate those systems. Well, how about when you're just going to get a robot out there and you're going to do it via some of our fast technology injection processes, UONs. And by the way, I'm a fan of that. I saw it firsthand, as Rick mentioned, when I was out there in 5th Fleet. But my point is, when you inject that technology fast and you haven't built a sustainment tail there on the training side, on the sustainment, on the maintenance, et cetera, you open up some of what we're talking about here on how it's all going to come together. So I'll wrap there by just saying, you know, my summary is we already have the high-end warfighters. We have robots coming down the stream here, and how we fuse that picture and build out the architecture will have a significant impact on how we then can tool up the high-end warfighters. Thank you very much, and over to you, Rick.
Great. I think we're ready to take questions, if anyone has any. Yes.
when you're planning, thank you, when you're planning a JTF, he said you can't expect to train up the senior members of the JTF and cyber while you're planning. And I understand the role of 10th Fleet and I understand the role of Cyber Command. So I guess my question is, and the point he made was that cyber is going to be contested, so that when you're setting up your JTF, you got to understand that there's going to be a degree of risk, and you need somebody who's knowledgeable at the top to prioritize. So the question is, are we educating our senior leaders? I'm a proud member of being a digital immigrant born after the information technology. What are we doing to educate our senior leaders in both the offensive, defensive, and mission risk capability of cyber?
Yeah, so it's an excellent question. You know, I was kind of chuckling to myself too a little bit when Admiral Hennigan was talking. You know, I can remember 20 years ago how proud I was, you know, to have my first 100 megabit floppy drive, right? And I thought that was really cool because I got to store all this data, right? And now we throw the term petabytes around like, you know, M&Ms, right? I think from the Navy's perspective, CNO is totally on board and understands the need to ensure that our warfighting force, not just at 10th Fleet, but across the individual warfighting domains, understands the cyber problem. In 2011, right before CNO Ref had retired, he actually did pen a very excellent SecNav or OpNav instruction that talked about, or CNO instruction that talked about the importance of the cyber domain to the warfighting mission in the stand-up of the IDC. And as part of that domain, he talked about the need to train every single warfighter that we have on the importance of cyber and how it impacts the overall warfighting mission. Even today at the Naval Academy, every mid now that goes to the Naval Academy has to take a cyber curriculum so that they get some baseline understanding of the fight that they're about ready to go into. Can we do a better job? Absolutely. But what we've got to get to is we've got to get to the point where we've built so much cyber complexity into the fleet today that, you know, we've often made it a little bit more difficult for everybody to understand exactly the plethora of cyber capability that they have at their hands. So working with Admiral Rowden's team and working with the other resource sponsors in DC, we're trying to get to the point where we start to standardize those architectures so that we can make the training and the education of the cyber force that we have. And remember, every sailor is a cyber warrior. Every sailor is a cyber warrior because, you know, the reality is, you know, if they're using a mobile device on board, even if it's their own personal mobile device, they have to understand what the cyber implications of the things that they do are. You know, we're working really closely with the resource sponsors and with the fleet to start to not only standardize the architecture of the cyber platforms that we use, but then to make sure that the training and for every sailor that's out there, officer to enlisted, you know, is taken care of so that we get that deeper appreciation of cyber in everything we do. I will say one thing, you know, what CNO has said often, this is not an IT problem, it is a warfighting problem, and he's addressing it like a warfighting problem. And I think as far as the Navy goes, we're really far, compared to the other services, we are very, very far along on that path.
Great, thanks, Jim. We should have some questions coming up that were submitted from the back. Let's go ahead and, from the narrator, take a few.
Can I add an exclamation point quickly?
Go ahead, Tom.
I think you hit the nail on the head, and I think that we have to understand this with the fiber of our being. Whether you're an aviator, whether you're a submariner, whether you're a surface warfare officer, if you wear the uniform, you have to know it. And I think that we've got a ways to go, but I think we're certainly moving in a direction that's going to allow us to do that.
The only other point on that, we've mentioned Naval Academy on the front end with new guys coming out of the chute. We just had a recent exercise out in 7th Fleet. And, you know, you sort of learn the hard way when they start turning systems off and the commanders have to learn how to react to that. So I think those are a couple of examples of where the message is there and we understand the challenges there. We certainly have to go after it.
Great, thank you. Next question, please.
Okay, this question is addressed to Admiral Rodman. With EW and ship signal exploitation equipment, the U.S. Navy has the largest set of mobile sensors and exploitation in the world. Two-part question here. Where is this capability being harnessed for warfare focus? And two, are we making the best use of this capability?
Yeah, so, again, yeah, seeing from an great, it's a tremendous system, has tremendous capability. And, again, to Admiral Hennigan's point, right, we're creating the next generation of sensors. They're going to collect even more data. So, the issue is not so much that you can collect a lot of data, because we clearly can collect a lot of data. The question is, what do you do with it once you have it? And how do you make the best utilization of that particular data? And I think there, we do have some challenges with regard to how we allow that data to be used. I wouldn't necessarily say that we have the best identity and access management solution across DoD, but we're drilling into that problem as part of the joint information environment. And as I said in my early opening remarks, right, the power is in that data. So the key is being able to give somebody who has the right identity and access management the ability to write applications, against that data set that extracts whatever warfighting effect they want to have out of it. And I think the problem we face today is that, for the most part, our systems, because they are rather stovepipe, typically lock data between the application layer and the data layer. If we get to a point where we could actually have a standardized compute platform, what you allow then somebody to do is write an application on that standard compute platform that can access that data store to create some kind of new warfighting effect. And think about the power of your Apple iPhone or your Android, right, which has that ability to allow anybody to develop an application for whatever purposes. If it's a game program, if it's a financial program, somehow they're able to quickly and easily develop an application, get it approved onto that platform so that you can utilize it to manipulate data in whatever that application is intended to do. And that's something that we have to. That's a future that we have to get to, because that's the kind of information power that will enable this high-end war fight. And believe me, in the future, I want some second-class petty officer on board a destroyer to have the power or the ability, if they are so inclined, to develop an application to achieve a new war-fighting effect, because that's the power of innovation, and that's what we have to take advantage of.
Great, thanks, Jim. Next question, please.
This one is for Admiral Lewis. And sir, have you begun to develop the tactics for the F-35?
Yes.
Next question.
Well, I'll just, without, this answer could be riddled with, to keep it at the unclassified level, let's leave it at that. We hear a lot about, in programmatics, about the F-35, just like we do about other platforms, a lot of kind of exaggerated, frankly, bad news story. But what I'll tell you we're doing right now with F-35, the Navy is going to be the last operator of the F-35 after the Marine Corps and joint partners and the U.S. Air Force. So we'll get to the F-35 game, after they've learned some things, which is, in a way, a good thing, I think. But what we're doing right now in our tactics development role is really figuring out how to employ the F-35 as a fifth-generation fighter in concert with fourth-generation fighters and E-2Ds and EA-18 Growlers, and really employ that platform in a completely new manner, in which we're going to be far more effective than we are presently. There's a lot of good work being done, and it's a big good news story. We talk about networks and being able to talk to one another. The F-35 design is one in which they've thought that through a lot more than they have it with previous low observable aircrafts aircraft types, and it's going to be a real game changer in the kinetic world and as a battle manager. So yeah, it's going to be a great platform.
Great, thanks, Woody. Next question, please.
We haven't had anything anything else come in via email or text. Does anybody in the audience have a question? Raise your hand and we'll get a mic to you.
Go ahead.
Thank you. This is for any of the gentlemen at the panel or all of you. Among the things that concerns some of us the most who work in and with some of the folks in the network security biz and the civilian side is not necessarily the guy in the cave with the air card, but the threats to our networks that enable our technological advantage on the battlefield, not just on land, the terrestrial fight, but at sea. Back when we weren't necessarily so convinced of our dominance in the electronic spectrum, we did some things vis-a-vis the Soviet Union that allowed our force to be fairly disciplined with our communications and our data transfer. What kind of training are we doing at this point with our command and control systems, with our war fighters on the business end of things to counter the fairly large possibility that we've got adversaries out there that can negate some of the effects of our precision weapons, intelligence platforms, ISR capabilities?
I'll go. You want me to take a crack, Tom? Or?
What? Go ahead, and then I'll follow.
Yeah, I guess I would just repeat, and maybe because I tried to put it out of my mind after I got beat up on it so much, but 7th Fleet just ran this exercise, and I really think it's part of what you're talking to. Somebody help me out there. What was the name of the...
I just got the debrief. I can't remember.
The big cyber... I'm sorry, it doesn't really make a difference, but very large scale effort to assume that the worst case happens to some of the tactical nets, the communication networks, et cetera. And it went over a significant period of time, highly engaged from 3rd Fleet and 7th Fleet, operators dragged in, pre-planned turn-off systems, and see how warfighters could then evolve to developing paths to still communicate, still employ their sensors, et cetera. And so I just throw that out that there was significant learning there. There was significant action items taken. I think it's part of the solution while the architecture folks and everybody else go after it. There's nothing like an old-fashioned warfighting exercise, and that goes to the message that this cyber issue is across the warfighting spectrum now. The message has been received, and we're exercising it. So I don't know, Tom, do you want to add anything on that?
Yeah, you know, when I was in the strike group, I said, hey, we were out steaming around the strike group doing strike group stuff. And I said, hey, why don't we do some of that MCON stuff? Let's shut everything down. Let's disconnect from the world. And it took, I don't know, a bunch of tries before we could get to that. Now, recycle 25 years ago. We would steam around an MCON like crazy. We would just shut it down. Now, we were a lot less connected, I think, back then than we are now. That doesn't relieve us from I think the task of understanding how to get our arms around that, of getting our arms around the information environment and understanding how to fight in that environment. It's pretty easy to see a missile, a gun, a plane, a ship, get your arms around it, understand it. We understand kinetics. We like kinetics because we understand it. And I think that what we are faced with now is understanding that the understanding that we have to have, we're going to have to drive ourselves to it to understand how to fight in this particular domain. Understanding the art of warfare in the electromagnetic spectrum. I think we're going to have to concentrate on it significantly as we move forward? I mean, it's a great question, and it's kind of, we can ask the question 100 different ways. Certainly it's front and center in my brain, and I think as a resource sponsor for surface warfare, and a guy who does budget man training equipped for surface warfare, there are all of these tentacles that reach into it that my good friend Twig Branch over at N26 has an aspect of it. Mike Rogers at 10th Fleet has an aspect of it. I mean, and Nasty Manazar in 98, and Joe Tofalo in 97, and Whaler Walsh in 95. We've all got a piece of it. And I think what we have to do is we've got to say, okay, how are we going to go address this, and then get it down into the execution of the tactics in order to be able to ensure that as the warfare happens, we can respond to it appropriately.
I'm going to just add a couple of things, and one, it goes from being in the waterfront out here in San Diego and watching and seeing some of our vulnerabilities and trying to work to buoy those up a little bit, and then also back on Navy staff. A couple of things. You know, one, we are doing more war gaming in the academic sense of seeing the impact of cyber, and I think there's a great appreciation. There's clearly an appreciation throughout Navy staff at very senior levels, and that's why you see the emphasis on what we've done with Cyber Command, the standing up of 10th Fleet, guys like Mike Rogers, you know, going into positions of great authority and the ability to influence. That makes sense, and it's going to be very, very positive. And the second piece is to go from war gaming to exercise. And as Bob brought up, the 7th Fleet rather exercise was an example. I also forget the name of which one we did, but in talking to the fleet commanders out there, they're doing it much like we did comm drills in MCON 25 years ago. We are now taking a look at the cyber piece, an area that I'm very passionate about. So it's two things, and one thing we can never forget is we are right now focusing on the cyber aspect of that. That is vitally important. Second part of that is the OLCOM piece of that. So the entire electromagnetic spectrum, it's the end-to-end exchange of information, needs to be monitored across the board. We need to understand vulnerabilities. It gives us tremendous capability, but with capability comes vulnerability. We need to understand how to protect it when we're being attacked, how to respond to the attack, and how to counterattack. And believe me, leadership's got that. We're working that. For industry members out there, boy, that is a growth area and something that we all need to work together on to fully understand, because it is complicated. It's why the Naval Academy is standing up a new Center of Excellence to do specifically that. But we need more than that. We need the teaming and cooperation. And with that, take another question. You had one, sir.
Yeah, this is directed at Admirals Rowden and Rodman. With a future of probable sequestration-type budget cuts that you face, how do we avoid being forced to make choices too soon on promising technologies, because we can't do everything, but there's so many different exciting things out there. What's the process we're going to use to try and nurture them as long as possible before we have to make the tough cut?
Right, it's a great question. And that's the knife fight in the phone booth that we have about every day back on the staff, not only within 96 but kind of across the spectrum. It's the balancing, what I would say, of the investment accounts with making the stuff we have today work accounts, and understanding what risks we can take in readiness in order to be able to continue to move those investments forward. And kind of the engineer in me says, you know, we're trying to solve a 100-variable equation, and we've got to assume away 98 of those variables, and we assume them away at our own peril. And I think it's my responsibility, and I kind of look at it as balancing readiness and balancing investment. And it's my responsibility as the surface guy to say, okay, to clearly articulate the risks that we in surface warfare are willing to take or not take in order to be able to invest appropriately in the future capabilities that we know we have to invest in. And certainly I think between BCA and between BBA and where it's going, and I mean, obviously we're I mean, there are some very, very difficult decisions that are coming down the pipe. But I think we have a good team. I think Vice Admiral Joey Alcoin, I think, has done a superb job as the Director of Warfare Systems in bringing, as Admiral Hunt referred to, the high nines together to execute a collaborative effort in order to try to get at where the readiness risks that we can take, where the readiness investments we must make, and then what investments in the future we can make in order to make that happen. So it's a knife fight in a phone booth on a daily basis.
Yeah, I guess I'll hop in too to follow up on what Admiral Rowden said. You know, one of the things that we're really looking at is, you know, we've looked at how other industries solve this particular innovation problem. We looked at biopharma as a great example. You know, the one thing we haven't done a very good job at is fostering open innovation, and a part of the problem was we were tied to very, very proprietary technologies. So by standardizing our architectures, opening those architectures up to industry to show you where our capability gaps and shortfalls are, and then describing for you, hey, you know, here are where we need you to focus your technologies to solve these capability gaps. And oh, by the way, we have a standardized architecture platform, computing, either hardware or software, that you can ride on. You know, our hope is that you know, we can foster that open innovation so that you can come forward with an idea that we can more instantaneously test on that standardized architecture that we have to ensure that it does resolve that capability gap or shortfall, and then change some of the ways that we look at the acquisition system in order to absorb that technology and get it in the warfighter's hands faster than we do it today.
Robbie Harris here, a former destroyer guy. Great panel. Question for you regarding what high-end warfare means. For a lot of people who write about it today, high-end warfare means war at sea. It's Guadalcanal revisited today against a peer competitor, with cyber sprinkled all over that. Is that what high-end warfare means to you? Is it Guadalcanal revisited today against a peer competitor?
I would say, Robbie, that when I think about, when you scrape all the veneer away, when you start talking about the execution of high-end warfare, you're talking about the execution of warfare that in order to continue to assure the sovereignty of the United States of America. And I think there's a number of ways that that can be attacked on the cyber side, on the kinetic side, and on other ways. And I think we've got to bring all of that together. From a peer, near-peer competitor, if there's a threat to the sovereignty of the United States, I think that's what we have to address.
I would agree with you. I think high-end warfare is, in a way, it's a little bit back to the future. And I think the way I think about it is, if I envision where we could, you know, potentially get a war in the next year, 5 years, 10 years from now, quite simply, the maritime component commander, the Navy Marine Corps at sea will be the supported commander. And that's a shift from what we've been doing for the last 20 years. And the question that I think we need to ask ourselves as warfare commanders, as leaders, is are we ready to execute that fight and assume that command? And, you know, we hear it thrown out a lot, you know, mission orders. We hear command by negation that we grew up with in the Navy. We hear decentralized or centralized command, decentralized execution that the Air Force touts, but doesn't execute a lot. We have become very used to centralized command and centralized execution. When we talk about what's going to be denied in exercises that was really kind of finite, and when we do MCON, and when we train to things as simple as communications jamming and things like that, it becomes a fight that is the on-scene commander is taking commander's intent and executing. And that's something that none of us are very comfortable with. The more senior we get especially, we get less comfortable with it. But the fact of the matter is, I think that's the high-end fight is, you know, it's kind of counterintuitive. The high-end fight becomes you know, the strategic corporal, and that he's got the information he needs to execute that fight in accordance with the commander's intent and ROE and everything else. But I think your question is right on. I mean, that's definitely my perspective.
We have time for one more question if anybody wants to take that. In the back, sir.
Thanks very much. Ron Gumbert, submariner. I know that during my submarine career, training was hugely important, and you've all referred to that today. Over the past 10 years, we've spent a lot of time in actual combat, which has provided the forum for our troops to practice and become proficient at what they're doing. Over the past 50 years, we see after every downturn that the funds available for training become very constrained, and it impacts our force. How are we looking at that implication to make sure that our people are trained not only in the combat arms that we've been exercising, but in the cyber warfare that we're talking about today?
I can hop on. I mean, I'm going to let Jim talk about cyber. I'll talk about the rest of it. As I think about the balance of readiness and investment, and I have certainly the history to go back to over the last 3 decades that I was around, and what I saw as we pressed through the 90s and we had significant investment, and then as we came into this century, in surface warfare, we started to take increased risks on the readiness side, on the training side, on the maintenance side, on the manpower side, and what we recognized, especially in the wake of the report that Admiral Phil Blyle did, was that the pendulum swung too far. And certainly I experienced that in both of the strike groups that I was in. And I made it a point to visit not only every ready room, but every ship. And there's many things to love about the sailors in the United States Navy, but one of them is you ask them a question and they are going to answer that question. And so with this kind of fresh in my mind, and having been mentored by Admiral Blyle over the years, I certainly stepped into the position of the resource sponsor within surface warfare with a perspective that when we take risk in readiness on the training side and on all those areas, getting it back is a pretty long and pretty torturous process. And what we have been able to achieve, really starting before, I just continued it, but starting before I stepped in, was the investments that we needed to make in order to ensure that we are moving training to where it needs to be, and those and those other the maintenance side of the house, the training side of the house, the manpower side of the house, and as Admiral Hunt, and it was easy for me to do, following the reorganization or the realignment of the OpNav staff, because the high 8s were separated out and turned into the high 9s, and I got manpower, I got modernization and maintenance, and I got training. I got it all. I got the whole enchilada. And so holistically, I think I have a much better opportunity to make those trades than before they were spread out to N1, N4, and hither and yon. And certainly one of the things, in concert with both Admiral Pete Gumatau down at Surfland and Admiral Copeman here, and I have extensive conversations with Admiral Copeman about where we're going on the readiness side. And I can say that we are bringing together Surface Warfare Officer School, and another part of the realignment is all of the engineering enlisted training is now under Surface Warfare Officer School. We're further starting to bring in some of the other surface rates under Surface Warfare Officer School, and so in a very short period of time, we're going to have all of the training for surface warfare enlisted an officer under 2 people. And then once we get to that point, I think we have a much better opportunity to do the things on the training side of the house, and with the stand-up of the Navy Surface and Expeditionary Warfare Command, I think that that will further align us in order to be able to ensure that we can most efficiently execute that training and get at those readiness issues that have plagued us for a while as we press forward into the future. So, I mean, there's a lot of work to do, and certainly the budget squeeze is going to continue, but I think we have a very good story with respect to competing for the limited resources in order to be able to keep that very precious asset on track.
Yeah, and I'll jump in right again. Working with Admiral Rowden's team, you know, one of the things we're really focused on is you know, I hate to say, acquisition commands are populated by engineers who love to design really complex things, but sometimes it's that degree of complexity which frustrates our sailors. So again, by at least on the cyber side, by moving to more standardized architectures, you know, what you don't have to do is retrain the sailor every time you deploy something brand new that they've never seen before. So, you know, we're looking at that approach. If we standardize the platform and then beyond that, everything is an evolution, not a revolution, you know, you improve the ability to have the sailor ingest new technologies much more quickly than they do today. We're also investing a lot of our time and energy in that human systems interaction design stuff up front. You know, the reason we all like our mobile devices is because, you know, the day you buy it at the store, you take it home, you don't have to go through 20 hours of training to figure out what it is, although I will admit I'm still finding out new things about my iPad some 2 years later, but hey, but it didn't stop me from using it right out of the gate. And it's that degree of simplicity that we're trying to build into the systems so that when they get in the warfighter's hands, you know, it doesn't look like something they can't figure out on their own right off the bat. And we're doing that by looking at design principles more up front than we ever have before.
Well, great. You know, all panel folks, I appreciate all your insight, your comments. The questions were terrific. I'd like to wrap with just one comment on my side. High-end warfare, what does that mean to me? It means dealing with the unknown, the uncertainty, the unexpected. If we go back through history, the high-end piece was the thing that we had not planned on. As weapon systems evolved, and people talk cyber right now, I'm not sure what it is next, but how we deal with the unknown and the uncertainty, and how we're prepared to act is exactly what this country expects of the United States Navy. We have always succeeded for several hundred years, and we'll do it for several hundred more. And it's incumbent, therefore, for everybody to learn as much as they can about a variety of things, to study, to innovate, and to act. And when we do that, we're the best. So how do we capitalize on our advantages? Our advantages are we have the best scientists and engineers in the world right here in the United States. We also have the best sailors to use that technology. How do we marry them up and get that thought process flowing once again like we did in the past? So we take the best of the best and we put them together. We get out of our stovepipes, we cross-pollinate, we share ideas, and we excel and succeed at every challenge that the country is faced with. We will do that, and that's a team. And so I look at the folks out there in uniform, I look at the folks wearing suits out there. It is teaming, cooperation, communication, sharing of ideas, making sure that we never leave this country coming up short, and I don't think we're going to. So I thank you for your interest today and the opportunity to speak. I thank each of the panel members. Thank you guys, did a great job. And as always, AFCEA, USNI, terrific. Pete, appreciate the opportunity. And have a great afternoon, everybody.